Okay, this is May 27. The ceasefire between the Zionist state of Israel and Gaza, probably the only entity or place in the Middle East, in the Arab world, that they actually have election. I know they didn't repeat it that many, but they have a fair and square election. They don't have a king. They don't have an Arab dictator. They don't have a fascist, a mass murderer like what happening in Egypt, a psychopath like what is in Saudi Arabia, or a military junta like in Algeria, or a fraction of tribes and militia like in Libya. Or in Lebanon, who have no idea what's going on in Lebanon. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, as they always say, they bombarded the shit out of Gaza for almost 2 weeks, killing more than almost 300 people, thousands injured, children killed, 60 or 8 of them. And the media cover this war on the native indigenous Palestinians for more than 70 years as a fair, equal party that have casualty on both sides, both party. Reaction to Hamas rockets. Israel has the right to defend itself. So the narrative in the Western media, it's appalling, and always adapting to the Zionist narrative. And the story of Palestinian hasn't been told in this country, not even-handed. Just telling, war. First victim is the truth. So, how the media cover the war on Gaza and the Palestinians, invasion of Eastern Jerusalem and Al-Quds, one of the Muslims' holy sites. And until today, even after the ceasefire, they've been arresting Palestinian, anybody participated in boycott or protest. I'm sure the Palestinian Authority are helping, providing the intelligence for the Israelis, Mossad or intelligence, to arrest those young men. It's almost follow from the playbook of El-Sisi. Just wait and then arrest people at dawn. People who participated in January 25th revolution, leader, the symbol. They are in prison or killed in Egypt. Israel been doing this. Israel's been doing this for more than 70 years. And you have idiots saying Israel has the right to defend itself. What do a Palestinian do have? The right to survive, stay alive, to resist? What do the Palestinians have? What kind of rights do they have?
I've not seen the Palestinian people rise up as one body from the river to the sea, and I think it says, it gives me a lot of hope.
Let me show you what it's like when a Jewish settler organisation takes over a home in this neighbourhood. This belongs to the El Kurd family. Now this is their home. This also used to belong to the El Kurd family up until 2009, when a court awarded it to a Jewish settler organisation. And they've been living here ever since. That's the distance that we're talking about. We're not talking about huge spaces, we're talking about a home taken over, part of a home taken over from a Palestinian family.
It's a fight about land and identity, land stalling in 48 was a promise from those who do not own, given to those who do not deserve. I think Nasser said that in the 50s and the 60s, and I think he got it right. He got a lot of things wrong, but this one, he got it right. Balfour Declaration, the British do not own this land to give it to Israel that they do not deserve. Then they brought God in the real estate business, and the rest is history. Now, any challenge to that narrative is anti-Semitic.
Britain promised Zionist support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. This came as a formal political letter known today as the Balfour Declaration. It also included that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. When World War I ended and the Ottoman Empire was defeated, Britain occupied Palestine.
Britain provided the muscle under which they could simply emigrate. I mean, they couldn't have immigrated were it not for the British presence. Because the crucial battle in the early stages was simply getting Jews into Palestine and acquiring land. They couldn't have done that without British governments.
Here, Mnar Adley, he's the founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press. We all know the Mint Press. She is our guest today. Welcome to the show, Mnar.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And Mnar means, wow, that is a name to keep you awake at night. Mnar means, well, the lighthouse, or in general, or what?
Mnar is a White House. Mnar means guiding light. And I hope that our news is a guiding light for truth.
How do you keep up to this name? I'm sometimes amazed how parents give names for kids and the expectation. You were born here in America, Mnar, right?
Yes, I was.
I know you've been following the media and how the media cover those last conflicts, 2 weeks of bombardments and destruction, and the images is so appalling and so graphic that you see people killed, and almost 70,000 Palestinians now are homeless and refugees in their own lands. But when you read the media in general, you get a different story. You get like this is a fight between equal party, and a conflict has been going on, meaningless, and a casualty on both sides. So what are this? How the media cover those events and usually the conflict in the Middle East? And do they have an agenda? Do they buy into a certain narrative? Are they ignorant, naive, or there is something behind the way they tell this story, the story of the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Well, Israel's defense minister, when the conflict had started, had made a statement that not one person, not one house, not one entity is immune from Israeli bombs being dropped on the Gaza Strip. And since then, we have seen the media do what they've been doing really well for a very long time, for decades, which is act as a mouthpiece for the Israeli, what Palestinians like to call instead of defense, but offense minister for their military, in presenting this conflict as an equal level playing field, just like you described, where it's Israel against Hamas. And when the media does that, what they're actually doing is enabling Israel's apartheid and their genocide and their bombing sprees against Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. Because when it's presented in a light where it's Israel just targeting Hamas, that dehumanizes Palestinians as if they are all human shields. That's the other narrative, that Palestinians in Gaza are human shields to Hamas. So every building, every mother that's pregnant, every child that has been targeted, every media office is now a perceived Hamas human shield, justifying Israel's offensive on the Gaza Strip. But luckily, thanks to social media and the power of the images and the videos that are coming out from activists and just civilians in Gaza and in Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem at Al-Aqsa Mosque, the veil has truly been lifted from the face of Israel to show the true face of apartheid and genocide, to show that Israel is committing grave human rights abuses and violating international law by targeting civilians. You know, as the media, presents this narrative that it's a conflict between Israel and Hamas, it's a war between Israel and Hamas. What they have failed to show is that over 95% of the people that have died in these attacks on Gaza have all been civilians. Over 60 children, 200 people, and now 70,000 people in Gaza have been left homeless in the Gaza Strip, which is already the largest open air prison. People are already drinking contaminated water. Israel has targeted the water treatment facilities, every single infrastructure, the roads that lead to hospitals. Israel has targeted the UNRWA shelters. So there really is nowhere for these people to go, and they're being deprived of all of their human rights in Gaza.
We've seen some shift, we've seen some coverage or some article written in New York Times and other outlets talking about the suffering and the victims of the Palestinians as human. And New York Times has a front page or front. The lead story was about Palestinian children who were killed, and they had their names and picture. But in the same talking, you found at least 3-4 different counter narrative. So they give those fair, kind of even-handed narrative, but they counter it, they clean it out, and then at the end of the day, when you read the New York Times or you watch CNN, at the end of half an hour, at the end of newspaper, you think it is really a fair. You don't know what to make. You cannot form really an opinion.
The New York Times, I'm glad that you brought them up, is not a neutral source when it comes to the Israeli-Palestine issue here, because first of all, their Jerusalem bureau chief, their family, their entire family, has enlisted in the Israeli military. The New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief herself and her family have served in the Israeli military. They are Israeli. The New York Times bureau chief bureau building was actually, the way it was formed was that the New York Times ethnically cleansed a Palestinian family out of their home so that the New York Times could build the New York Times Jerusalem bureau. So they themselves are not neutral on this issue. And none of that information that I just shared with you is disclosed when the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem publishes those articles about what's happening in the region that are very much through the lens of the Israeli military. The other thing is that the New York Times receives gag orders from the state of Israel on what they can and cannot publish.
Is that legal here?
It is legal in the United States. And so the New York Times obliges to what the state of Israel says they can and cannot publish about the conflict there. And we are seeing a shift. We are seeing the New York Times and other media organizations like CNN and MSNBC interview people like Mohammed al-Qurd. He's one of the leading voices in Sheikh Jarrah, one of the young men that comes from a family that's house is being uprooted in Sheikh Jarrah to make home for Israeli settlers. We're seeing that shift. We're seeing that shift where they're allowing articles to describe Israel as apartheid. We're seeing that shift where articles are being published where children and their families, and the truth about what Israel has done in Gaza, where they've completely massacred entire families and wiped out entire neighborhoods and families, is being allowed. But just like you said, they're still countering that narrative with major pro-war hawk people like IDF generals and Benjamin Netanyahu. And so this perception that the New York Times is objective is not true. However, we're seeing a shift in other forms where, like the Human Rights Watch report that came out just about a month ago, some people claimed, this is a little too late, but they made this intensive report showing that Israel was engaging in apartheid and crimes against humanity and racism against the Palestinian people. And in this Human Rights Watch report, Human Rights Watch is actually calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate Israel's crimes against humanity, its persecution of Palestinians. And so we're starting to see a shift in the establishment liberal circles, starting to showcase Israel as an apartheid regime, showcase Israel's crimes that they're committing against Palestinians. And we're starting to see that echo on the streets of the world. We just saw an unprecedented number of people just come out and march and rally for Palestinian human rights. I mean, a record number of people came out in London alone, over 250,000 people. That's what was estimated, a historic rally for Palestine in London. Over 10,000 people in France, where in France, it's actually illegal. It's illegal to protest for Palestinian human rights. France is like the beacon of democracy and free speech in Europe. And yet 10,000 people came out to march for Palestinian human rights, and they were met with water cannons and aggression and police state violence from the state of France. Right here in Minneapolis, we saw a historic turnout, although it's not as large as those two that I just mentioned. It was a historic turnout of up to 4,000 people that came out to protest for
Detroit and other city in the United States.
Yes, Detroit had, I think, over 100,000 people, which was a historic march for that state as well. So not only is the tone shifting, but people, because of the images that are coming out, if the mass mainstream media were to truly show what was happening in Gaza and in Al-Aqsa Mosque and Sheikh Jarrah, they also would flip and be out on the streets with us protesting for Palestinian.
Foreign policy decision that Biden has is selling arms to Saudi Arabia and selling arms to Egypt and giving Netanyahu a cover by saying he has the right to defend himself. Are you disappointing of somebody? We voted for him. It wasn't our first choice, but we had no choice. So what do you think of Biden's foreign policy so far and how he's handling this debacle there in the Middle East?
Well, I'm not disappointed because I already knew what Joe Biden would bring to the
kind of, but not that blunt, really.
Yeah, I'm not disappointed because I'm already frustrated with the whole Democratic Party and the Republican Party class. I mean, we have to remember that Joe Biden was the vice president under President Obama, where President Obama gave Israel a historic aid and arms deals in the history of the United States. And Barack Obama and Joe Biden, they campaigned under the guise and slogans of hope and change. And so we saw this again when Trump was in office. He was presented as the dictator, right? Even though I believe that any president from the two-party system is going to act as a dictator because it's the same thing. But Joe Biden came in again as this person who was going to rein in human rights again. But that word human rights has been weaponized, especially by the Democratic Party, because they have been known that when they use the term human rights and when they say we are going to bring back human rights, they're only going, that has been actually translated as a threat to do the complete opposite. As we saw in Libya and in countries like Yemen and other places where democracy was exported, when in reality it was, we destroyed these countries completely. So I'm not necessarily disappointed, but I'm not surprised either because of Joe Biden's history of being a Zionist. I mean, he gave this world famous speech about if we didn't have Israel, we in the United States would create an Israel in the Middle East. We need an Israel to act as a proxy for the U.S. military machine and U.S. empire. So Joe Biden may appear on the outside as Uncle Joe, Sleepy Joe,
Forky.
whatever, slow guy. He's just a nice guy. Anybody would want their kids with him, which he's.
I don't know.
I wouldn't want kids with him. He's creepy Joe.
No,
and
not that far.
And he's wide awake, abetting genocide and apartheid, and supporting Israel. And we are seeing this as Joe Biden approved the sale of $735 million worth of weaponry in the middle of Israel's massacre of the Gaza Strip. And so that doesn't show somebody who cares anything about human rights or social justice. It shows that this is somebody who is abetting genocide and apartheid, and it will go down in history that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both supported apartheid in Israel.
Some of the images that came out of Gaza, when you see those, and even West Bank, East of Jerusalem, and see this police treatment of young Palestinian, and it's almost the same as police brutality here in the United States. And you can see they do the knee on this Palestinian, and they do the same technique that Derek Chauvin did with George Floyd. And the way the Palestinian been treated, even what they call them the Israelis Arab, which they are Palestinian, is just they want to wipe off that national identity of the Palestinians. 2 million of them live in Palestine. They've been treated as second class, and Israel been treating the Arabs or Palestinian like this country been treating blacks. So why that connection is not made?
You know what? Israel represents the true face of U.S. empire and police state and ethnic cleansing, as you just described. It is the true face of the military machine. It is the true face of the police state. So as much as we like to say that there's police state reforms here, police brutality reforms here in the United States, we can't claim to be reforming our police here when we're exporting police states like the state of Israel, like the state of Colombia, which is right now committing grave human rights abuses against their protesters. We can't claim to fight for justice and stand for justice when the police in Israel, who are training US police to kneel on the necks of small children, of young men and young women. I mean, how many images do we have to see coming out of Israel where they're kneeling on the necks of young people? And yet the reason why we were so outraged by George Floyd is because it was broadcasted live for the world to see. So just imagine the Palestinian lives that were lost that we were not able to see on Facebook Live. So it's happening every single day to Palestinians. And just in the past week, Israeli police have been going around all of the Palestinian cities and neighborhoods to arrest young Palestinian men and women who were out protesting. So Israel is truly not a beacon of democracy if they're not allowing any sort of freedom of expression or freedom of speech in their country.
I know you are a big fan of Thomas Friedman. His last piece, he was claiming that what's happening in West Bank and Eastern Jerusalem, and even in Gaza, the uprising or the protest against Israel is because of the Palestinian now on TikTok, and that they see images and they communicate, and the internet behind the Israelis resisting the Palestinian resistance to the Israelis. And as far as I can remember, the Palestinians been resisting and fighting before even the internet was a thing.
The root problem here, which is, who controls the media, who works within the media. Today we have a very small group of companies that own 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. And on top of that now, We have big tech giants in Silicon Valley who work hand in hand with Israeli intelligence, with Israeli military, with the state of Israel to ensure that the narrative about Israel and Palestine is very much controlled, and voices and support for Palestinians is suppressed.
Well, Mnar Adley, the founder and chief editor of Mint Press, because we need to really have our own narrative. We need to tell our own stories.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much. It was an honor to be here.
Well, the honor is mine. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the day.
70 years have passed since the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic, took place in Palestine in 1948, in which more than 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully displaced from their homes and pushed into refugee camps in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and neighboring countries. But the Nakba didn't end in 1948. The catastrophe continues to affect more than 12 million Palestinians, who remain stateless today. Historical Palestine was mostly made up of Palestinian Muslims, Christians, and a small number of Jews, who generally lived together peacefully. The persecution of Jews across Europe led them to believe that they were not safe there, and Zionists saw Palestine as a prime location for a Jewish homeland.
And it was clear that there were Palestinians on the land. The Zionist leaders and common people alike got used to the idea that the only way of making Palestine a Jewish state is by causing the Palestinians to leave.
The Jewish Zionist movement began organizing immigration and buying land in Palestine. This was the first step in turning Palestine into a Jewish homeland.
وقفوني على حدود البدن هويتي قلت لهم النبي فهم خبايا